Welcome to the Jockle Podcast. I'm considering changing the name to the Hector Quinn Podcast. We're going to find out because these are the guys who are making the podcast happen. I'm just being pummeled in the comments. And it's true. When I come to an idea, it's the result of looking at different angles, looking at the big picture. And so when people come with a little nitpicky comment, and they think that's going to make me, invest my time in nitpicking their nitpick or whatever. Yeah, sometimes, just be happy I'm even engaging with the comments at all. I don't know. You give people an inch and they want a mile. So we're doing the Jockle Podcast. The current events are going to be the broke border wall. And maybe we're going to talk about heroic Omar. The hero, Omar. So we got the border wall, and the big problem with the border wall is it always focuses on the demos. That's the problem of democracy in general, focusing on the demos. You're not focusing on where power actually lies. Power never lies with the demos. The demos is just this Chthonian mass, and it doesn't have any aligned intention, aligned will. If you look at magnetism, what produces magnetism is when you have a bunch of electron fields that are aligned with one another. So the difference between non-magnetic ferrous material, iron, and a magnet is that in a magnet, all those electron fields are aligned in such a way that their collective force of all the electron fields actually produces a difference that we can see. We can watch magnets pull each other together, repel each other. But in a non-magnetized material, all of the magnetic fields are traveling in all kinds of different directions, so there's no apparent force. Now there's the same amount of magnetic force, electromagnetic force in a ferrous material or a non-magnetized material, any piece of iron, as there is in a magnet. The difference is that in a magnet the fields are aligned, whereas in in this piece of iron, chunk of iron, it's not aligned. It's going in every direction, so they sort of cancel each other out. That's how the demos works. The demos, obviously individuals have their own will. People want sex. People want their neighbors to be like them. So people are uncomfortable with diversity. People kind of get anxiety from sexual deprivation. So there are all kinds of individual wills that people have. But the political manifestation, the ideology, the ruling religion, all of the things are not determined by the demos. They are accepted or rejected by the demos, but they're not invented by the demos. The demos has no creative potential. You have to step outside the demos and look at what the elite is doing. Again, the elite can be a fairly small percentage of the population. Toynbee talks about this, about the creative elite that dominates civilizations, that determines the course of civilizations. This elite minority can be a small proportion of the population, but because it's a small proportion with an alignment of will, they can just totally override anything the demos wants. And so in terms of a border wall, it's a totally democratic idea. What's the idea? The idea is that we're going to make this huge wall, and we're going to have people stop, primarily Mexicans. We're going to say Mexicans, South Americans, they're going to stay out of the country. And then we're finally going to have an implicit notion of a stagnant America, conservative America. Of course, the problem is, apparently the Trump bill, and that's what we should call it. It's the Trump bill. It's the one he's signing. This is the way he's going. He's going with compromise. He's going with deal making. And it's not a betrayal because he always said he would do this. It's not as if people call him a liar. But there's a kind of internal structure he projects or he telegraphs a lot of his moves ahead of time. And so he said he was going to do this from the beginning. And it was all laid out. Nothing was really... It shouldn't be surprising. A lot of people are surprised because they've taken random anonymous posters on 4chan to be the message of Donald Trump. Like, we need to support Donald Trump because he's going to make America again. And that was an assumption that people made, and they weren't actually listening to what he was saying. So people are disappointed. But we've got the Trump bill. And the Trump bill is saying we're going to have a big, beautiful fence that's going to be easy to climb over, easy to destroy. At the same time that we have our big, beautiful fence, we're going to allow for all kinds of new forms of amnesty, existing forms as well as new forms of amnesty. And just for a thought experiment, if you had a big, beautiful wall, and this wall is 1,000 miles tall and whatever, it's impenetrable. But let's say just one Mexican enters the country, and you have a form of chain migration. And you say, okay, well, you're in the country, or a child. What's in the Trump bill is that if a child is in the country, an undocumented child, an illegal child is in the country, alien child, this child then legalizes the status of all relatives. So anyone related to the child, uncles, aunts, cousins, parents, whatever, because the idea is you can't separate children from their families. So with that, it's basically chain migration. And so if you have one child in the family, well, that just brought in the whole family. And then you've taken that one child, now there's 10 people. And you can just infinitely regress this, repeat the process until you've just granted legal status to tens of millions of people. Now the problem here is that once people have a legal status, then it's very easy for them to have kids in the country. Those kids are citizens once you're born in the country, and you've got a situation where they're voting in elections. I mean, we have a problem with Puerto Ricans who had a terrible natural disaster. They've come into Florida. They're going to turn Florida blue. I mean, I would be so amazed if Florida goes red in 2020. There would have to be a massive inflow of retirees coming down into Florida. And I just don't think, because Florida's been on the edge since 2000. I mean, it's been 20 years essentially since Florida has kind of like gone either way. And that was George W. Bush versus Al Gore. And Florida could have gone either way. And it's stayed in this purple area for a long time. And now you have this huge influx of Puerto Ricans as well as felons are voting. So the whole concept, we're stuck within this democratic framing. Now, I understand in a practical purpose that in the short term, we need to play the democratic game. There's no way around it. If you don't play the democratic game, you get stomped on. And it's a Bismarck said politics is war by other means. It's a non-violent form of war. And I approve of all non-violent forms of sustaining oneself, defending. I totally believe in non-violent defense. The libertarians would say that taxation is violent. We can go into that kind of philosophical, ideological argument later. But basically, I would support if someone said, hey, should you vote Republican or Democrat in the next election? I would say, well, chances are you probably want to vote for the Republican because that's going to shift the Overton window in such a way as we are taking one tiny centimeter inch step away from this brink of censorship. And we are headed toward this brink. I think, in my opinion, it's inevitable. So we should have a long-term plan for confronting what happens when we lose our First Amendment. The problem here is that people think they have this idea that they have an idea of complacency about it. That, the First Amendment could never be regulated. That's not true. Prior to the 1960s, actually, porn was illegal. It was obscene. And what happened is the ACLU came in and made a free speech argument. And so actually, freedom of speech after the 1960s became more all-encompassing than it ever had before. Before, if you said something that was obscene, that could be censored. So the First Amendment has always been regulated, really up until the 1960s, and there was this very pragmatic decision by pornographers to support an expansion of the First Amendment. That wasn't always the case. Historically, you look at the Alien and Sedition Acts back in the 18th century, and they were censoring people's speech. World War II, they were censoring people, throwing people in jail. They were shutting. Ever break the law? No. But they shut them up, and they did it because they said, well, it's a war. And if it's a war, you lose your First Amendment. So I've always been speculating that they're going to start a war with Iran, they're going to start a war with Russia, and use it as justification to throw everybody in jail that they don't like. They've done it before, they're going to do it again. So you need to be prepared for that. But in the short term, I say let's buy ourselves as much time as possible. I'm totally in favor of national populism, defending the First Amendment, defending other amendments that are pragmatic, that are good. But in the long term, you need a better solution. And, it's very troubling when, and I think I can reach people, maybe a millennial metaphor, a video game metaphor, where you've got two enemies. You've got the boss monster, and then you have the spawn monster. So the boss monster, he keeps producing spawn monsters, and you keep fighting the spawn monsters, but you're never attacking the boss monster. Well, due to the rules of the game, as long as the boss monster is alive, every time you kill a spawn monster, he just throws out another spawn monster. So what's the good strategy? You can't just keep infinitely killing the spawn monster. Now maybe you have to address them, because if you don't address them, they're going to kill you. But at some point, you have to damage the boss monster. And a lot of this stuff where you see the Republican Party, which is supposed to be the party of Trump, right? But Donald Trump himself, he's attacking... what's her name? Ilhan Omar? Is it Ilhan? Is it Ilhan Omar? I really want to get this Somalian Arabic Muslim pronunciation. Yeah. Ilhan Omar. Ilhan, she came out and she did nothing wrong. She did nothing wrong. She just came out and she said, and people have come down on her and they've tried to quash her. In fact, the mainstream media, I'm looking at these mainstream CNN is supposed to be this Soros-controlled network. Well, first of all, Soros is an anti-Zionist. Okay, so CNN is not a Soros-controlled network. But CNN is coming out and they're attacking her. They're attacking. Now, maybe she's not the brightest bulb in the bunch, but that doesn't matter. You don't need to be bright to know that does exist. And everyone who's attacking her, there's like two stages of attack. And again, she might not be that intelligent. I wouldn't necessarily want her to be president of my country. I wouldn't necessarily enjoy, sitting next to her on a bus or anything like that. It's not that I'm fond of her. But the statement that she made is just true. And you see everybody attacking her. And that's kind of when you distinguish between the spawn and the boss. See, the way I look at it in the video game analogy is Ilhan Omar, the heroic Ilhan Omar, she's kind of like when you're in the RPG and you have a few companion characters and you're fighting, and then the boss uses an enchantment spell and he's kind of taken some of your companions, and now they're enchanted and they're fighting you. And so, Ilhan Omar, yeah, it's not like she's wholly positive. It's not like she's the solution. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, when I see people attacking Ilhan Omar, it's like you're attacking the spawn. You're not attacking the boss. Who is the boss here? I can criticize Ilhan Omar. The mainstream media, CNN, is harassing Ilhan Omar. Why? They were never doing it before. She was completely fine before. But now she said, and therefore she has to be destroyed. The only time you should ever... See, here's the issue. It's like when Stalin gets up and makes a speech, and it's not that you didn't clap, it's that you didn't clap long enough. And so Ilhan Omar, now she has... she's pointed out, she forgot to say that's a good thing. She forgot to say it is wonderful that... She just very neutrally stated. There was no hatred, there was no malice. Now, you could say that secretly she's a hateful, malicious person. But again, in the statements themselves, what was wrong, what was hateful, what was malicious? On the surface, there was nothing there. There was nothing there. And everyone tolerated her before. And then she just says a neutral word. She says a one word. She just says the word. She's being called to resign by the mainstream media. So again, you gotta have a bigger view of things than just... vote Republican. Of course, again, in the short term, pragmatic, lesser of two evils, I'm not saying anyone should stop voting. That's not the point. But the point is, there's a bigger thing going on here. If Donald Trump built the wall, in fact, a wall can be bad. Walls are bad. You say, well, walls work for Israel. Yeah, Israel doesn't have birthright citizenship. So to say that, oh, well, Israel has a wall, therefore a wall is a pragmatic thing. The wall is the last step. The wall is the last step. First, you need to define who is a citizen, what is a country, what is a nation, what are we going for here, who holds the power. I would rather live in a state where I was a demographic minority, but I was aligned with the will of the elite. So for instance, for a very long time throughout history, I mean, you go back to the ancient Greeks, Greeks were leaving Greece. They were leaving Greece. They were sailing to France, and they were sailing to Russia, and then Alexander the Great, he went to Afghanistan. Why did they leave that? If nationalism is such a beautiful thing, living among your own people is the only thing that matters in the world. That is the only political consideration. We need to ignore everything. Ignore sexuality, ignore economics, ignore religion. Oh yeah, definitely. We want a secular state. We want a separation of church and state because that's beautiful. We want to separate all these things, and the only thing that matters. But what was interesting to me is how he was essentially making an argument that IQ is useful. Now, IQ might only have a 5% predictive power. He gave the example of, in the NFL, having IQ testing. Now again, IQ testing, it might only give you a tiny bit of information. It obviously doesn't tell you everything about the person. I mean, there's so much, especially NFL, you're looking at athletic ability, past performance, past injuries. You're looking at a whole host of issues. But an IQ test, it's cheap, it's easy, it's quick, so why not do it? Why not do it? If you're really trying to pick the best of the best, no reason not to do an IQ test. It helps. Okay, are you a quick thinker? Can you think quickly on the field? Can you follow complex plays and things like that? So there's nothing wrong with administering an IQ test. Nothing wrong with it. But Nassim Taleb says, well, because IQ isn't a perfect predictor, then let's just throw the whole thing out, and anyone who talks about IQ is a pseudoscientist. A pseudoscientist. Which, again, that's kind of how I feel when people are saying, oh, we just need a border wall. If we just had a border wall to keep these people out, then we'd have a beautiful, wonderful state. It's clear that the important thing here is not just feeling comfortable. I mean, we can cite Robert Putnam as much as we want. We can talk about the disastrous effects of diversity. We can talk about Charles Murray all we want. We can read his books, and that's great. But the negatives of diversity are not great enough to justify, obviously pragmatically, in all actual reality, it's not they're moving to Iceland, they're moving to Belarus. They could do that if they wanted to, but there are costs associated with it. So of course there's a cost to diversity. I'm not saying there isn't. Some people on the left will say there's no cost to diversity. Other people on the left are actually honest enough. There are actually plenty of leftists who will say to you, yeah, you know what, diversity is a challenge. That's how they phrase it. They say it's a challenge. It's a very corporate language that they use right out of Walmart's playbook. But they'll say, diversity is a challenge, but it's something that we need to overcome, because if we can't overcome this challenge of diversity, then we're never going to unlock the potential of humanity. We're never going to go to the stars or this or that. And that's kind of a Carl Sagan argument, right? We need to unite as a globe so that we can go to the stars, that sort of thing. And so a lot of leftists will admit that diversity is a cost. So, the idea that, oh, well, diversity is a cost, and therefore we must sacrifice everything just to avoid diversity. Well, no one's really doing that. I'm sure there are some, you could find, I'm sure in the 10 million people who live in Iceland, or the however many people live in Belarus, I'm sure you could find a few expatriates, and then you could interview them and say, well, why did you move here? They say, well, I like it that everyone's kind of on board. They might use cryptic language, whatever. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all. But statistically speaking, all of these people who are saying diversity is the worst thing that could ever happen are not putting their money where their mouth is. A border wall is stupid. A border wall is the last thing that you do. First, you gain mythological, ideological, political power. Then you start, throwing out birthright citizenship. You start reformulating the structure of the state based on, okay, who's going to be a voter? Does citizenship guarantee you the vote? Well, we don't give minors the right to vote. Minors are citizens. I don't believe that someone under the age of 18 should have the right to vote, because they're not going to vote on anything substantial. They're not going to vote on policy. They're going to vote on propaganda. I just do not trust. I don't trust younger versions of myself to know what's best politically in terms of policy, in terms of substance. It's all just, style and assumptions. And there's an argument to be made that actually young people in some cases that they're more focused on charism. They're more focused on the implicit features or the phrenology of a person. And so there's a kind of wisdom that children have that they're able to look at people and they're a better judge of character, whereas adults are often thinking more analytically, and so they're actually more fooled by lies than children. You could make that argument if you wanted to, but I don't think that's a big enough reason to say that minors should have the vote. And that's an important distinction to make, right? We don't just give all citizens the right to vote. We restrict the right to vote to those citizens who we believe are best equipped, who are able, who have earned the privilege of voting. We should not have universal suffrage. Now, we keep moving away from universal suffrage every year. That's the progressive, enlightened, democratic thing to do. And the reason we keep moving toward universal suffrage is essentially because there is a political power which is opposed to thinking people, and it's opposed to people outside of power who are trying to improve things for themselves. It's trying to monopolize power. And the way that it does that is it indoctrinates the demos through public schooling, through religious education, through media, through entertainment, through Hollywood. It indoctrinates the demos. And the demos simply becomes an extension of the existing power structure. And so people who are not in power, who are not politicians, who are not rich, who are not famous, who don't have anything, they have no leverage. But they want what's best for the country, they want what's best for their fellow citizens, and they advocate policies like, hey, let's not go to war with random countries in the Middle East. Let's not destabilize the Middle East. Let's not stop the Taliban from burning opiate fields, from burning poppy fields in Afghanistan. Let's just let the Taliban do their thing. You know what? There are a lot of people in the world. There are a lot of different governments in the world. If we had to, attack a government every time it did a little drug enforcement, then we would be at war with every country. Right? So, the Taliban, they want to burn some poppy fields. Let them burn some poppy fields. Probably good for the Afghanis. Probably good for Americans as well. Because that poppy might become opium or opiates in prescription drugs that are then given to United States citizens. We know drugs are bad. We know addictions are bad. We know that it traps people in a cycle of short-term thinking where they're only focused on the drug. And that's not a long-term sustainable life model, to be addicted to anything. Whether it's a physical chemical thing or whether it's an alternate reality. And I made a little compilation of just 3 short clips, basically. People playing video games get a dopamine hit. There's a kind of cooperative experience there where the individual playing the game sort of buys into the game, and the person who makes the game is drawing them in. So there's sort of an exchange there where one person is creating the alternate reality and the other one's buying into that. And you buy into that and you spend time in this alternate reality, and it feels great because it creates challenges that are attractive, that are logical, that make sense. So the game's not too easy, but it's also not too hard. And it gives you, it hacks into our reward mechanism. We have an internal reward mechanism that tells you when you are attracted to a goal, you should set that goal. And when you achieve that goal, we're going to reward you with some dopamine. That's how the brain works. And that sets people up in the same way that we are rewarded by dopamine when we eat food. We're rewarded by dopamine when we accomplish a challenge that we've set. The reward cycle is not capable of evaluating whether or not that is a good challenge to meet or not. The reward mechanism only accepts challenges just, without question from the conscious analytical part of your brain. So if you say, oh, this video game's so cool, I want to beat it so bad, I'm going to spend 100 hours trying to beat it, or 1,000 hours trying to beat it, and that's what you set out to do, and you convince yourself of that, then your reward mechanism says, okay, we just got the order from the chief, we need to start this dopamine cycling. So withhold dopamine when you're not meeting the challenge. That's when you get frustrated. You might have some cortisol increase, and then you achieve it, and then you get that dopamine burst. It's an addictive cycle. Food is addictive. Drugs are addictive. So many things tap into this dopamine cycle, and that's why weed is addictive. Weed is addictive. You sit around, you're smoking weed, you're not doing anything productive. It changes your psychology. I mean, we should stop talking about soy boys. We should talk about weed boys. These weed boys. Boys who smoke weed. Men who smoke weed are boys. Men who smoke weed, I mean, you look at their testosterone levels, of course there are exceptions. Of course you have boxers and MMA athletes. Oh, they could beat you up so badly. Of course they could. Because their genetics, their training, everything they do in life, they could be the most athletic person, and then they're smoking weed on top of that, not such a problem. But when your average Joe, who's already so debased, so the average person is obese, I'm talking about Americans, they're obese. They are, not very educated. The education that they have is mostly propaganda. It's not, they don't have wisdom. They're lacking a lot of the support structures that creates a healthy, sustainable individual within a healthy, sustainable community. And then you add weed on top of that, and that's kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. It's a debasement multiplier. When you have a star athlete, when you have Michael Phelps, and he's extremely successful, he's an Olympian, he's an amazing physical specimen. I mean, just his proportions are extraordinary. You take some guy like that, and then you put a little weed on his Sundays, or he gets a little weed after his training. It's not going to destroy him as a person. But you get some of these people who have nothing going for them in life, and then you add weed onto that, and that only justifies their watching of Rick and Morty. It only justifies the fact that they're still eating Cocoa Pebbles and sugary breakfast cereals, which are some of the worst things that you can eat. I mean, the fact that this is accepted, these, in a just world, these people who advertise the worst possible, it's carbs plus sugar, and you're advertising that to children, and you've totally removed, and you actually punish physical activity. We punish fighting. We punish backyard scraps. We punish people being rowdy, and there's this idea that children should be sitting in a chair in this public education for 8 hours a day, being sedentary. Sitting for 8 hours, possibly one of the worst things you can do for your body is just sit for 8 hours at a time. It's terrible. It's terrible for your posture. It's terrible for your circulation. It's terrible for your mindset, for your psychology. Because as you degenerate physically, that's the vessel that contains your brain. Everything is affected. It's all connected. So you take someone like this, you add weed on top of that, it's terrible. It only helps them to justify bad behaviors and bad habits. So it's kind of a debasement multiplier. So people shouldn't be smoking weed. Now, again, you could have a person who is very successful and one of their vices is smoking weed, but that doesn't make it stop being a vice. Just because you're a very successful person, we talk about functional alcoholics, there could be a functional weed user. There could be someone who's an excellent person in many senses, but they also use weed. It doesn't stop making weed a bad thing. Similarly with veganism, there are some people who have just such amazing genetics that it might be possible that they can be a vegan and they can be an extremely physically healthy person. That's possible. But again, if you take the average person, the average, especially, you're talking about Paleolithic populations. I mean, Northern Europeans are of the genetic stock that created Northern European peoples. There's a huge amount of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. When you're talking about Paleolithic hunter-gatherers in Northern Europe, you're not going to be eating a lot of fruits and veggies and carbs. in a Paleolithic Northern European diet, especially not during the winter. Now, you might store some grains, you might store this and that, but really, a huge amount of your diet has to be meat. And you look at, this is a very interesting video. I think I added it to the Really Makes You Think playlist. And the whole structure of the jaw, which we think of as immutable, we think of, the jaw, that's just genetics. But there's so much more to it than that. So there's a lot of interesting things with the jaw in terms of if you are chewing raw meat or uncooked meat or rare meat, if you have a heavy meat diet, what happens is your jaw gets much stronger. And furthermore, your tongue, which is actually a fairly strong muscle, pushes against the top of your mouth, the roof of your mouth. And this actually forces, because all of the structures in your skull, there's these sutures, there are these little fault lines between different parts of your skull, including everything that's attaching to your jaw and the front of your face and your nose and everything. All of that's attached to these, think of it like, the continents. It's not like they're flipping upside down and going every which way. They're pretty stable if you look at the Earth from a global perspective. Continents are pretty stable, but over long periods of time, they can shift. Similarly, your face can shift. If for 20 years, all you did was drink Soylent Green, that is, you get all your nutrients through just sucking and drinking liquids, your face is actually going to look dramatically different than if your diet mostly consists of hard grains, rare meats, things like that. Your jaw is actually going to change in its size. And a lot of the teeth problems that people have are because our jaws are not growing to their genetically expected size. So our entire DNA it's suited for a set of conditions. So people are supposed to be muscular. Everyone is supposed to have musculature. If you don't have musculature as a man, then it looks like there's something wrong with you. You look sickly, you look unwell. The reason for that is that the genes which are responsible for creating musculature rely on the fact that there is an assumed environment in which you're always, strenuously exerting yourself. You're moving heavy things, you're running around, you're wrestling, you're playing sports and games. All of this stuff is assumed in our genetic construction. So you remove that environment, you change that environment, we no longer have genes that are capable of changing fast enough. They're not able to adapt to this new environment, and so you have people who are very sick as a result. And it's the same thing with many different aspects, but especially with teeth problems. Why do so many people need braces? I mean, just imagine, before braces were invented, what were people doing? Did they just always have scraggly teeth? Did they have these terrible teeth? No. Actually, Paleolithic peoples had great teeth. So much better teeth. The thing is that they had so much wear and tear in their teeth. Their teeth were flat. Their teeth were flat because they were constantly grinding and chewing hard foods. Now we're always choosing, these very soft, squishy granola bars. We're drinking smoothies. This is the problem with smoothies. And the problem with baby food is the idea that, babies, they can't really chew food properly. And so, of course, at a certain age, it's appropriate. But now you're seeing like this Go-Gurt and yogurt, and I've even seen that they have these little applesauce packets. If you have children and you want them to develop the way that their genes are built in order for them to develop, they should not be eating applesauce and Go-Gurts and yogurts and whatever. They should be having a hearty diet, basically a paleo diet, that's going to involve them using the musculature of their face. Now, some people have done this weird thing. It's always weird how we have to compensate for this quick change in environment with all these, ancestral hang-ups in our DNA. People have invented now, they have these little squishy balls you can put in your mouth and you can chomp on them, and that actually trains your jaw muscles to be as developed as they would be if you were having a natural paleo diet. So these are the things that people are doing. But, you look around at people and you see these weak jaws and you see these weak chins. And I'm sure that I would look different. And they've actually done little twin studies with this. You can see twins who have had different diets, and you can see how that's impacted people, or different things that have affected them, whether you're breathing through the mouth, whether you're breathing through the nose, and so on. These things change the structure of your face over decades, and you can look at the difference. And so when you look at yourself in the mirror, you look at other people, ask yourself, is this what my genes intended for me to look like? Or has there been a rapid change in environment that has resulted in my genome is no longer capable of adapting fast enough, and there's a mismatch here and something's wrong. So once you realize that, once you unlock this knowledge that's really it's not being taught in health class. I mean, this is important stuff. It's not being taught in health class. Now, the particular thing of jaw growth development, you might not care. You might say, well, I'm just going to get braces and maybe pull a few teeth out and it'll be fine. Maybe that's your attitude. Maybe that's your opinion, and you don't really care about your phrenology. But the example is indicative of a larger trend, that essentially we have structures that were built for conditions that are 10,000 years old. These structures have not been updated, and so there's a total mismatch between the structure itself and the present environment. You can see that in so many things. You can see that in marriage. And it's very sad, actually. It's sad because we want to get married. We want to be traditionalists, right? But the problem is we have a situation where if you went back a century, how many female managers, how many female human resource directors were there? How many female teachers were there? There were some female teachers. I'm not saying women weren't in the workforce, but the professions that women would have would be, they would be working the loom, they would be working in sewing, they would be working making clothing, they would have all kinds of jobs. These would not be managerial jobs. These would not be jobs where you need a college degree. They wouldn't be engaging in these jobs. And so marriage worked in part because there was a huge economic disparity between men and women. It's not that women were necessarily at home in the kitchen all the time, although a lot of them were, because it's like, what's the point of getting a job when I'm barely going to make any money? I should just marry a man with more money and have kids and live that kind of lifestyle. But I'm not against women working. What I'm against is a society, and Tucker Carlson has pointed this out, I'm against a society in which we apparently, I don't think we've fully dealt with the disaster of the collapse of marriage. It wasn't gay marriage that destroyed traditional marriage. It was economics. And it wasn't feminism either, because again, feminism is a democratic movement. It's a mass movement. It was created by elites who said, you know what, we don't care if these people have stable families. We don't care if these people get to enjoy one of the best parts of life, which is having children. One of the most fulfilling, most beautiful parts of life, if not the most, is having your own children. Now, some people are an exception to this. You have priests, you have people who don't have children. That's not their purpose in life. But a lot of people, they're really just built genetically, psychologically. Everything is set up for them to have and raise a family. And that's their whole purpose. And that's basically where we get the term prole or proletariat. Proletariat comes from the Latin, meaning basically a person whose purpose in life is to have children. And that was not a negative thing. But now it is a negative thing because we have a situation, it's not that men have it's not that men are necessarily poorer or men are more lazy or men are less hardworking, or it's not necessarily any of that. Although I wouldn't doubt that our ancestors were more hardworking. If you look back in your own ancestral tree, you're going to see people who are better than you. And that's just the way ancestry works. Statistically speaking, the further you go back, the further you're going to find someone who is an amazing individual. But basically with this question of, I'm going to interrupt myself. It's actually interesting the way you have people like Jeff Bezos and other of these billionaires who their fathers were absent or there was something wrong with them. Look at Elon Musk. Elon Musk hates his father. And there are plenty of billionaires and millionaires who hate their parents, hate their fathers. And it's interesting to me because that sets up psychologically then you're biased toward a metaphysic in which the past is evil and the present and future is good. You're overcoming the past. And that's what I mean when I say that the Indo-European tradition is a leftist tradition, the concept of destroying the old order, destroying the past, bringing in something new, bringing in something better, bringing in Aristos, bringing in excellence, bringing in something better, bringing in evolution. So nature itself and Darwinism is kind of a leftism in that respect. And the Indo-European tradition, certainly there's a leftism to it. Now you can say, oh, well, tradition itself, anytime you talk about tradition, that there's a right-wing component to that. So, I suppose you have that. Certainly there's a constant reformulation, there's a constant cycling between right wing and left wing. So you have an old idea, that's the right wing, then you have a new idea. And the new idea supplants the old idea. That's the victory of the left over the right. That's what we continually see throughout history. That's what we will always see necessarily. But at some point, that new idea becomes an old idea. And then that leftism becomes right wing. And people, again, I keep harping back on this distributist video. And possibly there's a better video out there. If there's a better video, send it. I'm just fascinated by this. This constant cycling, and people look at it and they say, oh, this is a weird pattern. Why does history always move toward the left? Why does it never move toward the right? That's because new ideas are always considered to be leftist, and old ideas are always considered to be rightist. And the fact is that a lot of new ideas are terrible. But when a good new idea comes along, and it supplants the right, that's the victory of the left. If you have any kind of evolutionary possibility or evolutionary potential within any given system, whether that's a legal potential, such as in a Democratic or Republican situation where you can say, well, every 4 or 8 years you can elect a new person, or if it's non-democratic, maybe it's a military revolution, maybe it's a violent evolution. But nonetheless, that's a potential for evolution. Anytime you have the potential for revolution, you're always setting yourself up for the slow, eventual victory of leftism. Again, all leftism means it's a new idea. It's a new idea. And that's why, in comparison with the present political situation, I have to say, if we're going to challenge this system, we have to position ourselves as leftists. Because historically, that is how history works. Going back centuries, I don't care how far you have to go back, the leftists always win, the globalists always win, the internationalists always win. Ancient Greece was internationalist. It was not nationalist. They were internationalists. They went out into the world. They went from France to Afghanistan. They had slaves from all over the world. They were interacting with the Buddhists. They were interacting with all kinds of people. And they were globalists. And they would make maps of the world. They were interested in other parts of the world. They were interested in China. And it turns out it's possible that some Greek people did make it to China and they helped build the Terracotta Army. And you can look up that and research it and see if this is all a bunch of just fantastical nonsense or if there's any substance to the claim. But the Greeks were globalists. And if you look back at the Western tradition, it starts with the Indo-Europeans, then it goes through the Greeks, and the Greeks are another sort of a bottleneck, where the Indo-European tradition spreads from India to Ireland. And at some point, the Greeks manifest as the inheritors, as the firstborn son of the Indo-European tribes, and they really stand out against all the others, and they sort of stand out as the firstborn son, as the kind of first among many of all the Indo-European tribes, and they sort of continue on that tradition, take it to the next level. And the Greeks were globalists. I mean, you think about the Indo-Europeans, how they spread from Ireland to India. And that's pretty far. I mean, you look on a map from Ireland to India, that's pretty far. The Greeks, just one little tribe. I mean, you look at Greece, it's a small place compared with that whole Indo-European land that they spread to. The Greeks, such a small little territory, and they had colonies very far, very far. So that expansionary, sometimes it's called the Faustian spirit. That Faustian spirit is a leftist spirit. It's about going, encountering new things, breaking boundaries, going into the unknown. Now, of course, you need some sort of order in order to prepare yourself, in order to protect yourself, in order to advance yourself. If you have complete chaos, if you just accept every new proposition, well then of course you're going to die very quickly. If there's no selective pressure, and that's death. And I talked about this before on the Perennial podcast, the cycle between life and death. And you can't just be pure life. Because if you're pure life is pure leftism. Pure life is You're a refugee, come on in. You're a felon, you can vote. You are a child attracted for whatever the new MAP or whatever the new terminology. What are they calling these people these days? What do they call a minor attracted person? That's what they're labeling these people, in the hopes that they can normalize it. And they're saying, oh, you're a minor attracted person? Well, you go ahead and, you're a child, you're a young girl who wants to explore herself, or you're a young boy who wants to mutilate himself and take hormones. You go ahead. So this extreme leftism, this life affirming of just a yes man, someone who'll say yes to everything. Let's tolerate everyone, tolerate everything. Basically tolerate everything except intolerance, tolerate everything except hate. So every culture is equal, everything's good. That total life affirming leftism, obviously you take it to a point and it doesn't work anymore, because eventually there's so much deleterious stuff out there. There's so many contradictory stuff there that eventually the system breaks down in chaos. It can't sustain itself. But I would argue we don't have a pure leftist system. We do have a lot of restrictions in terms of our leftism. And the leftism it's strategic. It's not, and Hillary Clinton, wouldn't you call her a leftist, right? Hillary Clinton, she's got to be this anti-white leftist. And she said about Angela Merkel, she did it too fast. She brought in too many immigrants. Angela Merkel is responsible for the rise of the radical right in Europe. Now, a lot of people on the right had been saying the same thing for a long time. It shows you that these elites, people like Hillary Clinton, they're wise, okay? Now, Angela Merkel, you say, well, she's not wise. But there was a plan, there was a logic to it, there's an understanding to it. These are people who rule through the demos. So to say that they don't understand propaganda or they don't understand optics is stupid. The only way that they rule is through propaganda. The only way that they rule is through optics. They have no other method of rule. It's not that like they have a man with a gun on every street. It's not that they're hanging criminals in the street corners. They're not oppressing people with violence, and that's why violence is not a solution. I will never condone violence. I'm never going to avow violence. Never going to support it, even in a self-defense situation. I mean, it could be legal, but I'm not going to support people putting themselves into a dangerous situation. I don't think you should even do that. I think you should have the wisdom to know that putting yourself, just like we would say, hey, maybe as a young blonde woman, you should not travel to Morocco alone. That's a bad idea. Now, if a young blonde woman went to Morocco and some men attacked her and she somehow managed to kill her attackers, would that be legal? Possibly. I don't know the laws of Morocco. Would it be legal? Possibly. But would the grand experiment of traveling to Morocco just so you can be attacked and then kill these guys, was the whole thing worth it? No. And so the idea that, self-defense is legal, self-defense is right, you shouldn't even put yourself in that scenario. You should not put yourself in a scenario where it's a dangerous situation and you're going to be attacked. Nothing is gained from that. And the argument that there's this, it's very ambiguous. You have to understand that when people use optics, when they use propaganda, these people are smart. Like an ad agency does a lot of psychological study, does a lot of psychological testing, and there are a lot of hours and intellectual work that goes into creating mythology, creating propaganda, creating education. All of that stuff takes work. And so the idea that, we just need good optics, and then, no. It's easier said than done. Just say, we just need good optics. We just need suits and ties, or maybe a white polo with slacks. Yeah, that's the right optics. Like, the idea that it's so simple, so easy. And again, the idea that you have these people and the demos is just going to rise up by itself. This is the myth of the 1848 revolution right here. This is the myth that the population just spontaneously uprises. You know what? There were a lot of spontaneous revolutions in Europe. We call those pogroms. Now, did the pogroms ever succeed? No. The pogroms never once succeeded. What happened is you had a bunch of angry peasants who said, we're angry, for one reason or another. Maybe they were angry for religious reasons. Maybe they were angry for economic reasons. Maybe they were angry for reasons of criminal justice. It could be a number of reasons. Could be all the reasons. And maybe their reasons were made up. Maybe they were scapegoating. But in any case, you had these mass uprisings, these peasant revolts that we call pogroms. And did any one of them succeed? No. And do you know why they didn't succeed? None of them succeeded. Not a single one. Because the elite, because the leadership always put down the pogrom. It was always the bishop, or it was some king or some noble who said, whoa, 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 this is a disruption of law and order. He wasn't on board. If you don't have an elite on board, then your democratic uprising, you're marching in the streets, million-man march, none of that means anything. The feminist marches that we have in America, that number in the millions, the gay pride parades, those work because they have elite support behind them. So the first thing you do, the very first thing, you have to create an elite. How do you create an elite? What is an elite, by the way? What does it mean to be elite? What distinguishes the demotic, not demonic, but the demotic, that of the demos? What distinguishes the demotic from the elite? What distinguishes the two? Well, there are a number of traits. We can certainly talk about intelligence and IQ, but you can have a high intelligence, you can have a high IQ, and you can use that to play simulated chess games on your computer while you work, a 9-to-5 job bagging groceries or something. So you can be Chris Langan, and Chris Langan might have a high IQ, but does he have power? No. So intelligence does not confer power. And so, I agree, I guess, with Nassim Taleb to the point that IQ is not everything. I would disagree with him, and I would support Ryan Falk to the extent that IQ is a factor that we can look at. That's obviously not the solution to everything, but it tells us something. It tells us part of the picture. So when we talk about elites, one of the things we might look at is high IQs. But probably more important than that is the will. That is the will, that they have an alignment of will. Now, how do you create an alignment of will? Well, when we're talking about electron fields in our physics example, we're talking about magnetizing, taking something and magnetizing it. When we talk about human beings, when we talk about an elite and an alignment of will, the magnetizing force is mythology, ideology. So you have to have mythology, you have to have ideology. And one of the things that's very good to have is intelligence. You need all these things. And you need people who are disciplined enough that they can align themselves. Because the process of alignment, a lot of people, most people in fact, are very comfortable with cognitive dissonance. They have short-term goals and long-term goals. So a long-term goal of the average person, you say, tell me what would be the best situation for you in the next 20 years? Tell me your dream goal, your dream vision for the next 20 years. And you ask your average person on the street, average person who's in debt, your average person who dropped out of high school, whatever, they'll say, yeah, I want to be a millionaire, man. I want to be rich. So that's their long-term goal. Now, you look at them on a daily basis, and they're smoking weed, and they're obese, and they're playing video games, and they're watching Rick and Morty, and they're eating sugar pebbles, frosted oats, or whatever. And this is how they live their life. And you go up to them and you ask them, what do you want to be? What's your perfect future? I want to be a millionaire. Okay, what are you doing to make that happen? Well, right now I'm just chilling, but I'm sure in the future, something amazing is going to happen. I have this brilliant hope. So that's the kind of cognitive dissonance that the average person has. That on the one hand, they would love to be a millionaire, but on the other hand, on a daily basis, they do nothing to accomplish that goal. So you have to have people, an elite has to be somewhat fanatical. Fanaticism means you take a certain limited number of axioms, a number of axioms which have limited dissonance. There could be some dissonance, there could be some contradiction, but there has to be a limit to that, right? So you have a limited number of axioms that form their mythos, their ideology, and they take that and they follow it to the nth degree, and they take it to the extreme, and I call this vertical thinking. So let's go back through the list. We've got people who have relatively high intelligence, I would say north of 3 digits. They've got to probably be at least 110 IQ. Lukewarm. And then next you want people who have an alignment of will, so they're able to understand mythology, ideology, and then they need to implement that. And the implementation phase is the hardest part, because a lot of people can understand ideology. A lot of people can understand, okay, this is libertarianism, this is the Republican platform, here's the Democrats, we could talk about theocrats, we could talk about all kinds of plans, and they can understand that. But then you ask, could you actually implement that in your life? And most people can't do that. And when you have people who are able to take a set of axioms, revolutionary axioms that totally contradict everything else that's going on in the status quo, and to apply that vigorously in their own life, we call those people fanatics. And there are a couple of interesting examples of historical fanatics. Early Christian peoples were an elite. They were fanatics. They were martyrs. They were willing to take a certain set of axiomatic principles, that Jesus Christ was their Lord and Savior, and they took it to the nth degree using what I call vertical thinking. They took this core principle that Jesus is the first and the last, the Alpha, the Omega, they took it to the nth degree. And so someone said, well, you can either renounce Jesus or we're going to kill you. And they said, well, go ahead and kill me, because my mortal life means nothing to me, and go ahead and kill me. I'm going to die for Jesus. I'm going to go to heaven. So they had this vertical thinking, this intense vertical thinking, where they could take a short-term decision, life or death. Most people would say, I'm going to privately worship Jesus, but just for you, I'm going to publicly condemn him, be a crypto-Christian, and go hide in the woods or something, because I don't want to die. I'm pretty sure the Lord wouldn't want me to die, so I'm going to deny him. Even the apostles did that, so I'm sure I can get away with it. But those martyrs, no, they were vertical thinkers. They took a core principle at the root of their psychology, and they took it to the nth degree, and it governed every short-term decision in their lives up until their martyrdom and their death. That's the kind of fanaticism you need. Now, a lot of people associate fanaticism today with violence. They associate fanaticism with terrorism, and that actually is purposeful. So obviously, if you're an elite, you want to discourage fanaticism, because that's a threat to the stability of your status quo system. You want to destroy fanaticism. And so one of the ways that you attack fanaticism generally is to constantly propagandize, to take this word fanaticism and to associate it with people who are terrorists and people who are violent. Because anytime you can call someone a terrorist, anytime you can call them violent, then you can bring down basically unconstitutional forces on them. You can bring down the IRS, you can bring down whatever. There's all kinds of extrajudicial, well, normally the law is this, but because you're a terrorist, those laws, those constitutional protections don't apply. We have a whole different set of laws that basically mean you're screwed, you have no chance, you have no ability to even protest. You're going to be sent to Guantanamo. Right, there's no jury, there's no 12-man jury. It's just a judge on some special secret council, unelected judge. Totally no transparency. It's totally inaccessible. It's totally private, behind closed doors. And he says you're a terrorist and you're going to Guantanamo. So that's the power that the state has, and they set up that ideological, mythological, linguistic, semantic association between fanaticism, violence, and terrorism. They want to connect those three ideas together, even though, again, fanaticism doesn't mean you're a violent person. Fanaticism just means you're willing to die for your beliefs. Most people are not fanatics. And a lot of people, because it's obviously, deeply, we understand the power of fanaticism, and so a lot of people will pretend to be fanatics. And I'm not going to pretend to be a fanatic. I'm not going to pretend that I even have a complete system that I'm willing to die for, because it's not. I don't have a book. I haven't written a book. I don't have a book to give you on the perfect ideology or something like that. But I'm saying that if you want to look at what is an elite, how do you create an elite, what are the goals of forming an elite, you have to discuss these traits. You have to discuss above average intelligence. You have to discuss people who have a basic level of willpower, but then also the ability to reorient their will. And the Christians would say, not my will, but your will. That's what they would say in their prayers to Christ. That is the kind of fanaticism you need to complete the picture. But it's difficult traits, and I would boil it down to those 3 traits. That's kind of what you need. Then once you have that in place, then you can talk about, okay, now we're going to organize from the top down. We're going to organize a mass movement. And that can be done through propaganda. That can be done through all sorts of actions to influence the demos. You can do that once you have an elite. But if your elite is not really elite, if your leaders are themselves not very intelligent, if your leaders themselves are not very willful people, that is to say, they're always preferring the short-term good over the long-term good. So, for instance, their father-in-law has a hot wife, and, they might make a number of mistakes over a number of months. And they make that decision every time. Meanwhile, they're going out in the streets and they're saying, no, we must be radical traditionalists and extreme Christians. And we're putting our lives on the line, and we're willing to die and be killed and shot dead by Antifa. And then, he's going home and he's making these bad short-term decisions. So you look at that kind of behavior, and then, there's almost an inversion there where you can't have one without the other. You could have someone who says, yeah, I'm willing to die for my beliefs. But sometimes someone who's willing to die for their beliefs is not a morally good person in the totality of things. Being willing to die for your beliefs could just be someone who is suicidal but too cowardly to kill themselves. So you can get profoundly immoral people who actually feel guilt about their lack of morality, and they say, oh, I'm going to be a fanatic, I'm going to go die in the streets. Now, from a big zoomed out perspective, that can be a good mechanism, right? If you have a society and you have some people who are bad people and they feel guilty, well, maybe that guilt can be turned into something productive by them, joining the military and going off and sacrificing their lives for the good of the host society, for the home country, and they're going to turn their guilt into a positive act of courage. But ultimately, it's not enough to just be a fanatic. You also have to have the willpower to make good decisions. Another one is alcohol. Another one's alcohol, just like weed. Alcohol leads people to make poor decisions. And so when we're talking about a leadership class, an elite, people who like to get drunk on the weekends, people who think it's a good idea to have hard liquor on the daily while they're, doing their propaganda, and that is an elite. Again, an elite is above the demos. So I don't fault regular people. I'm not angry at regular people, and I don't guilt regular people for the way they are. Regular people, they like their beer. Justice Kavanaugh, he likes his beer. People like to smoke the weed. People like casual sex. People like all these things. And most people watching, in reality, you might have a galaxy-level IQ. You could have an off-the-charts 160 IQ. You could be very intelligent, but at the end of the day, you're not a very willful person. And you're not a very fanatical person. Or you've got one but not the other. And so as a result, you're making poor choices. You could have a brilliant person who says, I'm willing to die for this movement. But then they're making poor choices. They're drinking, they're smoking, they're, philandering. They're doing all things that they shouldn't be doing. They're not making the mythos the center of their life. And that's why we have to admire early Christians. And we have to view Christianity as part of the Indo-European tradition. It's something that's positive. You can criticize it, you can nitpick it, and you can point out this or that or the other thing. But in the grand scheme of things, Christianity is globalist, Christianity is internationalist. I would say Christianity, you look at these different, the Indo-European explosion, the Greek colonial explosion, the Christian explosion, the Germanic explosion. The Germanic peoples, basically, their homeland, the Germanic homeland, is, basically Denmark. That's the center of the Germanic world, Denmark, and it's inhospitable. You think of these people living in Northern Europe without electricity. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine living in Northern Europe and you don't even have like a Colosseum or anything? You're living in structures created from wood, and you have some fire, and you're expecting people to live in those conditions through the Scandinavian winter. I mean, and again, we're even talking about time periods. If you go back thousands of years, you're talking about time periods when the climate was even more harsh. It was even colder. We're talking about Ice Age conditions. We're talking about woolly mammoth conditions. So you're talking about people who survive in these conditions. Incredible stuff. Incredible stuff. And these people from this very small, depopulated Paleolithic population, really isolated from the rest of the world by the fact that it's so cold, and they're just such a wild people. And then they exploded. They adopted this Roman civilizing, the you could say the right-wing ordering force of Rome, the status quo of Rome, and they adopted a lot of that hierarchy, and they adopted a lot of those property norms, and they just exploded. They went to Ireland, and they went to Russia, and they went to Byzantium, and they went to Northern Africa. They exploded. And that they were globalists. The Vikings were globalists. The Vikings were internationalists. They wanted to go to new countries. They wanted to go to new cultures. And often they assimilated. The Normans, who spoke French, were descended from the Vikings. So they weren't like, well, I am a Nordic person, so I have to live in a Nordic homogeneous land, and to go anywhere else would just be too much diversity. This isn't about the white picket fence. This isn't about having neighbors who look like you. That is not the fundamental force that creates and destroys civilizations. A little bit of diversity ain't going to kill you. What's going to kill you is when you have an elite who's hostile to you, who hates you, who wants you dead, and you don't have a counter-elite. See, if you just destroy the elite, if you nuclear bomb the world, and everyone's wiped out and everyone dies, what's to say you don't end up back where you started? The only thing that stops you from a new hostile elite, from replacing the old hostile elite, the only thing that stops that re-rolling of the die, is if you have an elite in place to replace the old elite. You have to have a new elite. You have to have people who, you look at the status quo, and the millionaires and the billionaires, they have all the power. They have the whole entire media, and you've got nothing. You've got no military power. A AK-47 is nothing against the United States government. $70 billion. It's nothing. You talk about these autonomous drones. Tell me how that AK-47 works when you've got an autonomous drone knocking on your door. I mean, they can just airstrike you. They can have an autonomous drone airstrike your house. AK-47 means nothing. They can have a tank. AK-47 means nothing to a tank. I mean, you look at the Hungarians. The Hungarians had guns, and they went out on the streets and they started shooting the tanks. Soviet tanks won. Soviet tanks win every time. So, the United States government's going to crush these Second Amendment people. Not that I don't support the Second Amendment. I think anything that annoys the elites, that makes them think twice, is a good thing. But, ultimately that's not going to win out. So you have zero power. And if there is some kind of collapse scenario, if there is some kind of market disruption, now a lot of people are saying, interest rates are so low, they're at a record low. Well, interest rates are actually being increased by the Fed. So they're increasing interest rates, so they're not at an all-time low. And, but you are seeing a lot of growth, and people are saying, is this a bubble? Is this not a bubble? Well, if it is a bubble, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? People need to fashion an elite. And but in any case, don't just tell me that, well, I'm not an elite, so this is all useless. Like, you're telling me all this stuff about, fanaticism, willpower, intelligence, and, there could be some others, but those are the three main ones. You're telling me all this, but it's totally not actionable. I can't do anything because I'm just a useless, mediocre person, and nothing's ever going to change. Well, why don't you support the creation of a new elite? And you could do that in a number of ways. You could become like Jockle. You could become a manager. You could become a consultant. Could be a consultant on marketing. And we could, I'm terrible with this. I don't know how to market. Apparently I'm supposed to have a podcast and episodes, and I'm supposed to talk about current events. And I haven't been doing that. I'm terrible, because I actually kind of hate that. That purist stance doesn't really hold up to the evidence, and I think we have to say that ultimately this internationalist, universalist idea of Yahweh, that Yahweh shall be the God of all nations. That Faustian, there is a kind of Faustian spirit, that world-conquering spirit, that I think didn't start with Judaism. I think it started earlier. You look at Sumerians, you look at Indo-Europeans, you see that spirit manifesting itself, and you can call it demonic. And if you're an extreme right-wing thinker and you're an anti-natalist, then you're going to call that kind of globalism demonic. But I like evolution, I like globalism, I like meritocracy. So I'm not going to reject that, but I'm going to say it's a specific iteration. So there's some kind of deeper truth that we can go back to and look at. And of course, the Jewish community has its own problems that Hector Quinn, I think, is the one who keeps bringing it up. Oh, they intermarry with Europeans at a rate about 50 to 60%. And so that's demographically bad. But at the same time, the Orthodox are having 8 kids per woman. So they're sort of solving that. They're sort of delegating, okay, the secular Jews are going to assimilate, but then the Orthodox Jews are going to have all the kids be the breeding stock to then create new Orthodox Jews who will convert to secular Judaism, who will then integrate, and this process just keeps going on. And so the Jewish population isn't actually decreasing, but it's maintaining itself and diffusing throughout the population ideologically, mythologically. So I think that's a sound strategy. So if I had to choose between the two, I know which one I would join, and it wouldn't be the warrior religion, because I think that stock is going down. But do we have to make that choice? No, I think there is a third option. That's a genuine, honest European tradition. If you understand Freemasonry as part of the European tradition, and you understand a lot of these things as part of the European tradition, then you see a lot of solutions, you see a lot of paths, you see a lot of vectors that you can explore and build off of that are genuinely European. You don't have to look for a foreign religion to do that, or a religion that is not, because, I read it and Jewish prayers just say you can only pray for the Jewish people. There's no, Tikkun Olam is touted as a universalistic thing, but you read a Jewish prayer book and it's all like, this is how you pray for the Jewish people about this, and this is how you pray for the Jewish people about that. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Christianity is all about praying for everybody. And so, in the true spirit of universalism, that appeals to me much more, that you pray for everybody. And this exclusivistic thing, again, to convert to Judaism, if you have non-Jewish family members, it means you're rejecting them on the basis of their non-Judaism. You regard them as somebody that you wouldn't, especially pray for, that you would, just pray for. So converting to Judaism, why a lot of people don't do it is because there's something inherently problematic with it. There's something difficult about it. We could go, again, that's a whole separate video. That's a dicey topic. But I think there is a European solution, a non-Jewish solution. But again, if I had to choose between Islam and Judaism, it's pretty clear which one is the good stock, which stock is going up and which stock is going down. Islam is self-destructing. The Muslim world has a huge problem with birth rates. Iran has sub-replacement fertility. That's terrible. And all across the Muslim world, fertility is tanking. Orthodox Jews maintain their fertility. So in terms of fertility, Muslims are going down. Jews are doing pretty well. So yeah, we've got all this discord. Discord is trash. Discord is colloquialism, vulgarity, and Discord is Fed posting, and Discord is demotic. It is of the demos. And that's not what we're doing here. We're having an extremely fine-tuned, highly developed vertical thinking. This is a vertical thinking leftist globalist channel, and that's what we're trying to develop here. It's going to be great. The funny thing is, before I looked at the time, I made it to 2 hours, and I was like, that was nothing. This last 16 minutes has been... It feels like it's been 2 hours. So we're going to stop the video here. Hope that was fun. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.